So I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Edson Burton now.
Hi everyone. I've got to resist the temptation to sing. So whenever there's a mic and it's loose, I sort of think I'm back in my cover band days and I'm going to burst into a soul song. So I guess in some ways, I think, Catherine, you alluded to it earlier when you mentioned some politicians who have pointed the finger at artists as the cause of gentrification. And it's something which my colleague and boss, Emma Harvey, can certainly attest to, as hearing that sort of discourse. And I've been in Bristol now since 1994, and for me there was a particular kind of myopia involved in that comment, especially as I think, the title suggests, the artists have always been there. So what this short presentation is about really is maybe trying to clarify what we're really discussing and being a little bit more precise in this discussion around artists and gentrification. The hidden assumptions. So often I think there is a sort of a popular discourse in our sort of hashtag generation around artists and gentrification. And what I want to do is just sort of pull some of that apart. So one of the things then, perhaps a myth of a pre-gentrification BAME working class community that existed before these evil hipsters descended on their communities and displaced and pushed them out from the late 90s onwards. The inner city, so for some that has also sort of led to some kinds of discussion which almost feels a bit like a sort of a development versus council conspiracy, which is to cleanse the inner city both of its BME populations and of its working class people. And the evil culprits in all this are white students, artists, second career artisans who are tired of the city and decided to brew specialist beer. So, or bread. So according to this then, artists are the vanguard of gentrification, wittingly or unwittingly. And I say wittingly or unwittingly because I ran a project I think last year or the year before where we had a discussion in which Doug Francisco was part of the panel, in which he discussed also the sense that sometimes not always being aware that you might be a pawn in the developer's game. But regardless of that then, artists being construed as the vanguard of gentrification, wittingly or unwittingly. A lot of this has come to light in the discussions around St. Paul's Carnival, and the idea that these outsiders have descended on this area, and the evidence of that then is in a lack of consideration and concern for the local residents, a lack of interest actually in the culture of Carnival, and so on. And so in some ways it's made this quite fraught. And so Carnival becomes the sort of the moment at which these wider demographic shifts, as they are mythologized or real, becomes discussed and becomes quite intense. So I just wanted to take a look at what are some of the factors then that brought this BME community to Bristol. And I guess in some ways I'm focused particularly on the African Caribbean community. Some of it's relevant to other BME communities as well. So the push factors: underemployment in home societies, poor opportunities in home societies. So young populations, educated but finding very little means for demonstrating opportunities for education. So the 1948 Immigration Act, which again opened the doors of migration to Britain, the McCarran-Walter Act 1952 in the USA, which meant then that Britain became a destination, in particular for African Caribbean migrants, where it wouldn't have been, it would have actually been the USA. So the McCarran-Walter Act basically excluded a number of people from working in the farming and agricultural industries in the US. But of course, a high demand for labor in Britain is the key thing. So this BME population in the 50s and 60s that then settled in these inner city areas were rebuilding Bristol, rebuilding Britain, called upon. As part of building that community and the struggles against discrimination and so on, then there were a number of activists in the community that instituted St. Paul's Carnival, amongst a number of other voluntary sector organizations, some of which exist today, but mostly don't. But also the key thing is that that journey from the 50s to the 60s helped to enshrine and solidify a sense of community identity built around resistance. a real, in a short space of time, sense of a chronology and history of which people are proud. So these inner city areas then become sites of memory, sites of identity, which go far beyond whether or not people are actually resident in the area. And this is what makes their importance so, and why the discussions around them so intense. But also in some ways I think perhaps a little misleading. Of course, Paul Stevenson, young boy, Bristol Bus Boycott. For those who don't know, he was the leader of the Bristol Bus Boycott, and he's sort of honoured in Bristol, including in St Paul's and so on. But the question I want to ask is how plural actually was St Paul's? How plural is the inner city? And I think some of this is resonant with other areas in Bristol and in Britain. So I came to Bristol in 1994, as I said, but some of the findings of the 1991 census was important to my early research. And what I found was a very big sort of dissonance between what was the popular ideas of St Paul versus the statistical reality. So one of my first experiences of being in Bristol was popping into a bakery shop on Stokes Croft and being told, don't go into St Paul's, you're decent, you are, but it's really rough down there. And so I kind of assumed that, the machetes just flying through the air and the risk of death or murder was just so imminent. And of course, one of the subtexts was that it's so rough because it's a BME area and it's filled with vice and crime. In actual fact, the St Paul's ward in 1991 was only 19% African Caribbean, and less than 31, and that was 31% of the total Ashley ward. So in the 2011 census, the BME population has doubled from 8% to 16%, but it's nonetheless still quite, the majority of the populations in the inner city wards remain actually white British. And the distribution of the population has also shifted much widely across the city. So we see people now moving into North Bristol, and also we see a much greater influx of people into Lawrence Hill, Eastville, Ashley and Lockleys, Central Land and Hillfields. So there is movement out of the inner city, and my suggestion is that that's not only to do with gentrification. Artist Pay 2016. So according to the Arts Council recent reports, the Livelihoods of Visual Artists Data Report, artists earn an average of 16,000. Does that make sense to anybody here? Because I was on less until about 3 years ago. So earn an average of 16,150 each year. 36% comes from the art practice. So many artists portfolio living in order to actually have a living income. Also evidence of significant gender pay gap in the sector and differences in pay for artists focusing on different mediums. So again, I think this may be similar figures being quoted for writers, and I suspect it's even more variable for musicians. This is one of the reasons, I guess, for the drain out of the sector and why some artists concentrate on other aspects of arts administration and so on as opposed to producing their work. So in many ways then, my argument is that artists have been drawn to the inner city for the same reasons that the migrating populations. So Alfred Fagan, don't you have anyone pass through Sussex Place? Okay. So anyone know of Alfred Fagan? Okay. The hand that I suspected to go up went up. So Alfred Fagan was a pioneering Jamaican-born writer who lived in St Paul's, and he's commemorated in this bust. He wasn't when he lived in St Paul's for a number of years, and that inspired much of his writing. So artists moved into St Paul's, live in St Paul's, for the same reasons, I think, as many of the migrant communities to which we are meant to be displacing. Cheap rents, bearing in mind artists' incomes are lower, alternative lifestyles, and that can cover a range of alternative obviously in quotes, because what may be normative to some is seen as alternative into a more conservative areas of Bristol. to be part of artistic communities, similar other kinds of disadvantage if you're BME artists, LGBT artists, disabled artists, and so on. So, to put this in personal perspective, I first came to Bristol in 1994, as I said, and my first encounter was the Bristol Black Arts Group. It was a writers' group. And the writers' group, like many other black arts groups, satellited around the Kumba Centre, which was an arts centre which was basically started initially taking over an old inkworks, and sustained by sort of a kind of a consortium of Rastafarian grassroots interests and professionals and so on, including Alfredo Vasquez, who was a Gibraltarian by birth, who was the director through much of the period of Kumba's life and times. So it was a hub for black artists within and outside the inner city. Now, many of the artists that I knew through that lived in St. Paul's for a range of reasons. And one of the things was, again, when I did my oral history research, was the sense that people were corralled into St. Paul's by sometimes quite aggressive demonstrations of racism in the 70s and 80s. So it was always, in some ways, a diverse community of different incomes, different lifestyles, artists and non-artists and professionals. Black artists move out and move in. So a number of those artists that I knew during that period of the 90s up to 2004 that I knew moved out of St. Paul's, sold up, great housing offers, and also in some ways their artistic careers, like the careers of some black professionals that I knew, meant that they were able to afford to move out and live in other areas. And for me, this sort of parallels the journey of many other black professionals who lived in the area, for whom it was a matter of agency rather than displacement, that they chose to live in other parts of the city, because in many ways they were forced into a particular zone of living by discrimination and a pattern of discrimination that existed in the 70s. So with the loosening up of that to an extent, and also a rise in their incomes, people actively chose to live elsewhere. Hence we see the movement of African Caribbean and other BME groups into other parts of the city. Not to suggest this hasn't been without tension, as we see in Hillfields, for example, in Somali communities, or in Lockleys, when a friend of mine, for example, was targeted by Combat 18 when he moved into Lockleys. So sometimes the vanguard of movement into areas often unearths this kind of tension. The Arts Council gave Kumba the opportunity in, I think, 2003 to buy the carriage works. But the idea was that they had to match that funding, give a grant of 1 million and fundraise 1 million for, I don't think it would have been the entire site, but an aspect of the site. I think many of the issues that arose for other black voluntary sectors groups were also evident in why Kumba was unable to raise that fund. So again, we're talking in some ways, I think, the disparity between voluntary sector organizations in terms of boards with access to particular skills sets, with fundraising knowledge, with access to fundraising networks. But that led in some ways to the decline of the organization. So that offer wasn't achieved, and it would have been interesting to think then how we would be discussing gentrification had it been done so. If you look at, for example, in Chicago, Bronzeville, then Theaster Gates would be seen as either someone who is regenerating the area or potentially gentrifying it, and he's an an African-American person. So I'm just questioning to what extent that this mythology or this discussion contains a racial component, which is not entirely always, I think, reflective of other processes that might be going on. So the decline of the black voluntary sector and parallel developments in Stokes Croft, austerity, and also, I think, began really with the Labour government, a changing from funding for groups for their existence because they provide a particular service towards service-driven business models, decimated many organizations, which in many ways were never begun and never had those sort of skills in place. And so a swathe of organizations disappeared for that reason, including black voluntary arts organizations as well. So in many ways, the voluntary sector organisation includes the arts organisations that I knew and gave us a particular kind of vibrancy to the inner city were already disappearing and in decline when, for example, Stokes Croft, Hamilton House, as a site of the rejuvenation, of Stokes Croft had begun to take place. So rather than seeing that one is a causal effect of the other, what perhaps I think is the case is that there were a sort of asymmetrical process, on the one hand of a rejuvenation of one part and a decline on the other. And they are not necessary, and the factors that are tied into that, I think, are more complex than being seen as directly relational. So instead, I would say that looking today, 58% of white British, according to recent reports in in Ashley Ward, is 58% white British. There's a transition from an African Caribbean population, which was 5.4%, or is now 5.4%, to a rise of an African population in Ashley Ward, and that's 8.5%. So what that's also saying then, what I'm trying to suggest is that actually, rather than just talking about gentrification through to these evil hipsters moving in, there are other kinds of transitions that are going on. And some of those demographic shifts are one kind of ethnic minority population and being replaced by another. So Bristol Somali population in particular has become one of the largest ethnic minority groups in these parts of the city. So gentrification is one process that's happening in the inner city, but I would say that there are wider transitions that are occurring, of which gentrification is a part, but by no means is it a sort of a process of upward income shift upwards in a way. So to kind of conclude, I wonder if we get underneath this discussion of gentrification, we can look at that perhaps it's a sort of a veil or a camouflage or even a distraction from looking at other factors, which we perhaps need to consider more carefully. And that is, I think, the class, ethnicity, capacity and skills that exist between artists and arts organizations. To what extent are we really talking about artists moving into an area and displacing people, or to what extent are we actually talking about different kinds of artists, perhaps with higher income, perhaps with access to different networks? Are we really talking about ethnicity when we know that both white and black artists struggle to live in certain inner city areas while others move in? Or are we talking about class? And what is then the trajectory for working class artists, regardless of ethnicity, and participant in that discussion of ethnicity? To what extent is that different from artists that have come through middle class or even professional routes of another kind? Capacity between arts organizations. And I think that, again, that's an important one to consider. I think that rather than think about some organizations displacing others, that if we think of it in ecology of this sector, how can we skill share? How can we support organizations that don't have the level of access or those kind of skills within their networks and boards which allow them to become sustainable? And I've seen the transition from some organizations, because they've been able to access those skills or survive the various kinds of crises. The fragility of the black arts sector is a sign of more complex process. So austerity, the sort of movement toward business models, I think in some ways a difficulty to recruit the kind of skills that are needed to survive this much more, dare I say, hostile environment for arts and arts organizations. So, and to conclude, disparities between artists and arts organizations again. So, what I just really hoped I was able to raise is just, can we be a little bit more precise when we talk about gentrification? Can we be a little bit more precise when we consider this discussion around artists and their role in gentrification? Which artists? What is this sector? What does it look like? Who is the artist? They are white, they are black, sometimes they have unequal access to resources, and sometimes that runs along lines of race and class, sometimes it doesn't. So just to reiterate again, the artists have always been there, but the conditions have changed. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for friends? Hi.
I was wondering, it's clearly you've gone through like an oral history, found out oral history of kind of what happened in the area. I was wondering if the myth has also kind of tainted the communities that aren't involved in the arts, who maybe have been told that they're being pushed out. Like, do they feel like that, or do they actually understand that there's these other things at play?
I think you're quite right. I mean, I think that the problem with popular discourse and how it's used, oh dear, I'm gonna just, how honest do I want to be? Be honest. Sometimes there are people who are genuinely unclear as to sometimes a wider context, and sometimes it's also politicking. And I think it doesn't best serve communities to suggest it's all about gentrification coming from, and also to dog whistle who are meant to be the kind of the key architects of gentrification. So yes, I think what tends to happen then around, when I mention Carnival as a site, is often this is where these discussions come to bear around gentrification and so on. The other thing to bear in mind is that there are particularly iconic establishments and buildings that no longer exist within the area. So if you are, within St. Paul's, for example, in particular, some of these key iconic buildings, whether the places of leisure, entertainment, or voluntary sector organizations have moved or have gone. But in my experience, while there are macro factors involved, some of which I've cited, they are also to do with particular stories of managerial competence or not. These are things that all organizations suffer and not. But the problem is that the explanation is given that it's all because of gentrification. It's always because of some sort of white force coming through. And in actual fact, I think sometimes we need to look at it more complexly as to how can communities scrutinize organizations? How can they best support organizations? How can other organizations help genuinely to support an ecology? I think one of the striking things for me around being in Bristol and the discussions around Carnival in particular, is that it was always a multi-ethnic, cross-class sustained organization. And in some ways, the current discourse around it is that it's so black-led, but that didn't mean black bodies were necessarily delivering all the work. What made it sustainable was a recognition that it was a broader skill set that's involved, and that's what helped the organization to survive and flourish. So in many ways, I think then simplistic narratives are played out on all sides, when I think what we need to do, I'm a historian, I'm always going to go like to the backstory. But in some ways, only because it helps us to have a clearer idea of what are we actually talking about and what are the solutions, what kind of help and what kind of things do we need to be mindful of? And they're not always the way in which they're given.
Well, it's when you said solutions. Yeah, I mean, it's a thorny issue about artists and gentrification. Artists are opportunists, so they'll dive into areas where they have the opportunity of getting some space, whether it's cheap or back in the day when it's squatted. You know, there was a whole load of stuff going on in Old Market, wasn't there, until the people that own the buildings.
I don't want to cut you, but just want to add a sentence that sometimes they're coming from outside, sometimes they're born and brought up and live in those communities all their lives. So they're actually just carrying on living and just they're artists. Yeah. Yeah,
and then the building owner decides that, you know, an artist has made the area better because artists are generous and they make an area interesting, and they tend to be quite peaceful, you know, in their way. So that just has that. I mean, there is stories of developers employing artists in order to bring up the area so that they can then move in and capitalise. But the solution, and it's a difficult one, PRFC is doing it a bit but struggling, is to work out ways in which we can take ownership of buildings so that they are permanent. You know, working out a way where we can manage to get into buildings and keep them. Because we, as artists, we have a history of taking on the empty and the difficult and the, you know, scraggy and making it vaguely livable, whatever. I mean, Art Space, Life Space is the classic example of doing that brilliantly. But at the end of the day, the people that own the buildings are always going to push you out. And that's where I support Chris and PRSC, because he's trying to find ways, and he's got a leg up, but you know, he wants PRSC to be community owned by people. So you can scrape together, maybe it's 5,000 people with 500 quid, I don't know, but some way of saying, no, we're here, this is ours, F off. You know, and that way you keep that good artist vibe in a community. And it might be that because that good artist vibe is in that community, that then the community gets a bit nicer and more people want to move in. That is the problem. I don't know if Battersea Art Centre around there, well, it's London, so everything's just gone ridiculous in London. But you know, what's funny in London is actually areas that are worth a fortune around Brick Lane, where I used to live years ago, are still pretty bloody scraggy. I mean, they might have expensive artisan coffee and bread and a nice health food shop, but actually there's still a mass of historic, well, that area and historic communities. You know, it was Jewish, then it was Indian or Bangladesh, you know, but there is still a big community of people that have been there for a long time. Do you see what I mean? It's like, it doesn't always have to end up in a massive gentrification.
No, and I think, again, it's, in some ways, it's about, so that's an example, as I think you can see in, because Deborah and I both have been to Chicago, that artist-owned spaces can sit quite harmoniously within communities, and rather than being seen as pushing them out. I think the key thing is about relationship. What is the relationship that exists between the space and the between the space that might be run by an arts institution and the communities that are around it? I think it might be a different challenge for arts organisations that are new to an area and not necessarily aware of the context. But it's also a challenge for organisations that might be seen to have sort of grassroots risen out of communities as well. When a demographic changes, for example, to what extent is an organisation that was initially founded by African Caribbean or an Asian community still speaking to the doorstep community? So this is the interesting thing around the kind of imagined space of St. Paul's. To what extent, for example, is a carnival now negotiating, and I can say this because I share these kind of conundrums with the board, how do you in fact speak to the current doorstep community when in actual fact the organisation and the ethos of it is based on something which is no longer in a sense as clearly materially the case as it was, as people shift out of the area and they live in other parts of the city, but nonetheless it's a site of ownership and stakeholding.